According to church records stored in a restricted archive beneath an old Roman basilica, there exists a set of handwritten diaries kept by a priest for more than 4 decades. The ink has faded in places. Some pages are stained with water, others with something darker that no archivist ever officially identified. These diaries were never intended for publication. They were written late at night, often after long hours spent inside rooms where the air felt heavy and the silence pressed down like weight on the chest. The priest who wrote them believed that if he did not record what he witnessed, the truth would be lost, buried beneath polite explanations and comfortable disbelief. The first entry is dated simply, March, year 1 of appointment. There is no dramatic opening, no flourish, just a line written with careful restraint. Tonight, I was reminded that evil does not announce itself loudly. It waits. Those who later studied these diaries noticed a pattern. The earliest entries are calm, almost clinical. The handwriting is steady. The sentences are measured. Over time, the script tightens. Letters lean forward. Lines press into one another as if space itself had become insufficient. The priest was Father Gabriele Amorth. According to Vatican appointment logs, Father Amorth was officially assigned to the Ministry of Exorcism in Rome after years of service as a journalist, theologian, and priest. He did not seek the role. In one early diary entry, he admits he was reluctant, believing the position would be temporary, ceremonial, or rarely used. He was wrong. Witnesses who worked with him during his early years later reported that he changed within months, not in any visible theatrical way. There was no dramatic loss of faith or sudden obsession. Instead, there was a quiet seriousness that settled into him. He spoke less. He listened more. He prayed longer, often alone, long after others had left the chapel. The diaries suggest that his first case arrived unexpectedly. It involved a woman in her early 30s. Her name is omitted, replaced with a single initial. Church guidelines required anonymity. According to medical documents referenced in the diary, she had been evaluated by multiple psychiatrists. The diagnoses varied: severe dissociation, acute anxiety, possible psychosis. None of the treatments helped. Her condition worsened. Father Amorth wrote that when he first met her, she appeared exhausted rather than violent. Her hands trembled constantly. She avoided eye contact. When asked about her symptoms, she struggled to answer, as if the words were being pulled from her mouth against resistance. The room where the meeting took place was small and undecorated. No candles, no symbols, just a wooden table and 2 chairs. Father Amorth insisted on this neutrality in early evaluations. He wanted nothing that could influence suggestion or expectation. He noted something unusual almost immediately. She reacts with fear not to holy objects, but to prayers spoken silently. According to his account, when he prayed internally, without moving his lips, the woman stiffened. Her breathing changed. She looked toward him, confused and alarmed, and asked him to stop speaking. When he replied that he had not spoken, she accused him of lying. This detail appears underlined twice in the diary. Medical explanations were still considered primary at this stage. Father Amorth documented consultations with doctors, psychologists, and neurologists. He attended meetings. He read reports. He was careful to avoid conclusions. Yet the entries from that week end with a sentence written much darker than the rest. There are things the mind alone cannot hear. As months passed, cases multiplied. The diaries describe men and women from different backgrounds, different ages, different levels of faith. Some were devout. Others were indifferent or openly skeptical. What united them was not belief, but disturbance. In several entries, Father Amorth writes about the smell. Not decay, not sulfur, but something stale and oppressive, like a room sealed for decades and suddenly opened. Witnesses later confirmed this detail, stating that certain rooms would develop the odor suddenly, without any identifiable source, and that it would vanish just as abruptly. He recorded physical reactions as well: sudden drops in temperature, unexplained fatigue among those present, a sensation of pressure in the ears, similar to changes in altitude. None of these phenomena occurred consistently. That inconsistency disturbed him more than repetition would have. One could dismiss a pattern, he wrote, but randomness suggests intention. The diaries reveal that Father Amorth often questioned himself. He doubted his interpretations. He worried about causing harm. He feared mislabeling illness as possession. In several entries, he writes prayers asking for restraint, not power. Let me see clearly. One passage reads, "Even if what I see terrifies me." The first formal exorcism he documented occurred nearly a year after his appointment. According to the diary, the subject was a young man brought by his family after a prolonged period of violent behavior and auditory hallucinations. Medical interventions had failed. The family insisted the voices spoke of sacred things with contempt, mocking prayers and twisting scripture in ways the young man could not have known. Father Amorth insisted on a final medical review before proceeding. The diary includes references to EEG results, psychiatric evaluations, and interviews. Only after all avenues were exhausted did he agree. The exorcism took place in a private chapel. Present were Father Amorth, another priest as witness, a doctor, and 2 family members. No one else was permitted. He describes the atmosphere as tense but subdued. There was no screaming at first, no thrashing. The young man sat quietly, head lowered, hands folded in his lap. When the prayers began, his lips moved slightly, as if repeating words silently. Father Amorth noted this with cautious optimism. Then something changed. Without warning, the young man lifted his head and spoke in a voice that did not match his own. Not deeper, not louder, just different, flat, measured, unemotional. The diary does not record the exact words spoken. Instead, Father Amorth writes that the voice addressed him directly, referencing details from his life that were not publicly known. Childhood memories, private doubts, moments of failure he had never confessed. Witnesses later confirmed this account in sealed testimonies. Father Amorth wrote that he felt a sudden urge to stop, not from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of intrusion, as if something had stepped too close. He continued. The prayers intensified. The young man's body grew rigid. His breathing became shallow. The doctor monitored vital signs, reporting nothing that explained the physical strain. Then the voice laughed. The diary records that sound as deeply unsettling, not because it was loud, but because it was inappropriate. It did not match the situation. It expressed no humor. It was laughter without joy. The exorcism lasted over an hour. There was no dramatic conclusion, no collapse, no instant peace. Eventually, the young man lost consciousness. The session ended. Father Amorth wrote that he left the chapel feeling unsettled and uncertain. He did not declare success. He did not claim victory. Instead, he wrote one line that appears again and again throughout the diaries. This was only an introduction. Over the next decades, the entries grow darker. Father Amorth describes cases that resisted months of prayer, subjects who reacted violently to blessings they could not see, individuals who spoke languages they had never studied, not fluently but with enough structure to communicate intent. He documents failures as meticulously as progress. In one entry, he describes a case he abandoned after realizing the subject's condition was purely psychological. He writes of relief, not disappointment. Not every darkness is external, he notes. Yet there are entries where his tone shifts entirely. In one passage dated nearly 15 years into his service, he describes an exorcism that took place in a private residence. The home belonged to an elderly woman who had lived alone for decades. According to parish records, neighbors reported hearing her speaking loudly at night, arguing with unseen figures. They also reported sudden power outages localized to her apartment. Father Amorth was skeptical. Electrical issues were common in the area. Loneliness could explain much. When he arrived, he noted the silence. The apartment feels occupied even when empty, he wrote. The woman greeted him politely. She offered tea. Her demeanor was calm, almost cheerful. She spoke fondly of her youth, her family, her faith. There were no immediate signs of distress. During conversation, Father Amorth silently recited a brief prayer. The woman paused mid-sentence. Her smile faded. "Please," she said softly. "Not that." He asked what she meant. She looked genuinely confused. She denied hearing anything. She laughed it off. The diary records that later, during prayers spoken aloud, the woman's posture changed. Her shoulders tightened. Her hands clenched. She began to recite prayers backward, word by word, without hesitation. Witnesses present stated that her eyes remained calm throughout. The exorcism began. According to Father Amorth's account, the entities speaking through the woman did not rage or threaten. It reasoned. It debated theology. It challenged doctrine with precise arguments. It attempted to undermine his confidence by questioning the Church's authority, the existence of evil, the validity of the ritual itself. It wanted conversation, he wrote. Engagement. He refused. As the prayers continued, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. The diary mentions a sudden heaviness, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe deeply. Candles flickered despite closed windows. A framed photograph fell from the wall, without explanation. Then the woman screamed, not in pain, in anger. The voice that followed was no longer calm. It accused Father Amorth of interference, of disruption, of trespass. It spoke of time, of patience, of long work undone. The exorcism ended abruptly when the woman collapsed. Medical assistance was summoned. She survived. Her condition improved temporarily, then worsened weeks later. Father Amorth wrote that this case haunted him. Some presences do not resist, he noted. They endure. As the diaries progress, Father Amorth begins to reflect more deeply on the nature of what he faces. He questions the simplistic portrayal of possession. He writes that evil rarely appears as chaos. More often, it presents as order twisted subtly, convincingly. He documents moments of doubt. There are nights I fear I am only hearing echoes. One entry reads, but echoes do not answer questions. The physical toll becomes evident in his writing. He mentions chronic exhaustion, difficulty sleeping, vivid dreams that blur into waking hours. In one entry, he writes of waking to find his hands clenched in prayer without remembering falling asleep. Despite this, he continues, church officials occasionally questioned the necessity of his work. Skeptics dismissed his reports as exaggerated or symbolic. Father Amorth responded not with argument, but with documentation, dates, times, witnesses, medical reports. He believed that truth required record, even if it was never believed. One of the most unsettling aspects of the diaries is the recurring mention of recognition. He writes of subjects who, upon seeing him for the first time, reacted with immediate hostility or fear. Some refused to enter the room. Others became agitated without explanation. In several entries, he notes a phrase repeated by different individuals in different places, years apart. Why is it always you? He underlined this phrase every time it appeared. In a diary entry dated nearly 30 years into his service, Father Amorth describes an encounter that deeply disturbed him. The subject was a teenage girl referred by a rural parish. She exhibited symptoms of depression, self-harm, and dissociation. Her family was hesitant to involve the church, fearing stigma. They agreed only after the girl began speaking during sleep, addressing unseen figures with familiarity. Father Amorth approached the case cautiously. He spent weeks observing, speaking, listening. There were no immediate reactions to prayer, no aversion to holy objects, no dramatic manifestations. Then, during a routine blessing, the girl looked at him and asked a question. "Do you remember me?" He replied that he did not. She smiled sadly. "You will." The diary ends that entry abruptly. There are no further details, no explanation, just a blank space where additional notes might have been expected. The following entry, dated 3 days later, is written in noticeably shaky handwriting. I am beginning to understand that time is not experienced the same on the other side. He does not elaborate. As the diaries near the later years, the tone grows heavier. There is less description of individual cases and more reflection on cumulative experience. He writes about patterns emerging only after decades, about how certain behaviors repeat across cultures and generations. He writes that the most disturbing cases were not the violent ones, but those marked by patience. Evil that screams wants attention, he notes. Evil that waits wants possession. The final pages of the first volume end with an entry written late at night. Father Amorth describes returning to his room after a long day of sessions. He writes that he felt watched, though he was alone. He dismissed it as fatigue. He knelt to pray. Halfway through, he felt a sudden resistance, not physical, but internal, as if the words were being pushed back into his chest. He forced himself to continue. Then he heard a sound, not a voice, not a whisper, a breath, close enough to feel, but with no presence he could see. He wrote one final line before closing the diary for that night. They are learning how to follow. The next diary opens without ceremony. No introduction, no acknowledgement of the passage of years. Only a date, written smaller than usual, as if space itself had become cautious. According to internal Vatican annotations attached to this volume, Father Gabriele Amorth had by this time performed thousands of exorcisms, formal and informal. The number is not emphasized in the diaries themselves. He rarely counted. Instead, he cataloged sensations, reactions, patterns that only emerged after repetition stripped novelty away. He wrote that by this stage, he no longer expected dramatic manifestations. They are inefficient, he noted. Noise wastes strength. Medical professionals found no abnormalities. Psychological assessments suggested mild anxiety. Father Amorth met the man in a neutral setting. No vestments, no ritual, only conversation. He wrote that the man spoke calmly, articulately. He described a feeling of pressure behind his eyes, especially during moments of silence. He avoided prayer, not out of fear, but because, in his words, someone listens when it's quiet. During their meeting, Father Amorth silently prayed, as he often did. The man did not react immediately. Instead, several minutes passed before he paused, mid-sentence, and asked whether anyone else was in the room. Father Amorth answered truthfully that they were alone. The man nodded slowly. "That's what it wants you to say," he replied. The diary records that no formal exorcism was performed that day. Father Amorth sensed something restrained, deliberate. He noted that forcing a confrontation prematurely often strengthened resistance. Over the following weeks, the man's condition deteriorated. According to hospital records cited later, he began to experience episodes of lost time. Hours passed without memory. His wife reported changes in posture, voice, and mannerisms that appeared briefly, then vanished. When Father Amorth was called again, the man refused to speak. Instead, he wrote messages on paper. The handwriting shifted mid-sentence. Letters changed shape. Pressure varied. At one point, the pen tore through the page. The message read, "You are early." Father Amorth underlined the sentence twice. The exorcism took place weeks later, after exhaustive consultations. According to the diary, the ritual began quietly. The man sat upright, eyes closed, breathing evenly. When the prayers commenced, his lips did not move. His body did not react. Several minutes passed in silence. Then the man opened his eyes. Witnesses later described the gaze as unsettling, not because it was hostile, but because it was focused with unnatural intensity. He did not blink. He spoke one sentence. "You misunderstand our arrangement." Father Amorth wrote that this was the moment he felt genuine unease, not fear, recognition. The entity did not claim dominance. It did not threaten. It referred to coexistence. It spoke of agreements made unconsciously, of invitations extended through despair, resentment, or isolation. It argued that possession was rarely forceful. "It waits to be needed," Father Amorth wrote. The ritual intensified. The man's breathing became irregular. His muscles tensed, then relaxed in unnatural waves. At one point, the doctor present reported a sudden spike in heart rate without corresponding physical exertion. The entity grew quieter. This silence lasted nearly 10 minutes. Father Amorth noted that silence during exorcism was more disturbing than resistance. It suggested calculation. When the voice returned, it was faint. "You will forget this," it said. The man collapsed shortly thereafter. The exorcism ended without clear resolution. In subsequent weeks, the man reported improvement. The sense of observation diminished. Sleep returned. Life resumed. Father Amorth did not record this case as successful. "Some withdrawals are strategic," he wrote. As the diaries progress, Father Amorth begins to reference encounters that defied traditional classifications, cases where there was no single entity, but a presence diffused across memory, environment, and behavior. In one entry, he describes a convent where multiple sisters experienced similar disturbances: whispering at night, shared dreams, objects misplaced and returned to different locations. There was no history of occult activity, no trauma, no obvious cause. Father Amorth approached cautiously, suspecting psychological contagion. He spent days observing routines, speaking individually with each sister. He found no signs of hysteria or suggestion. Their accounts were consistent, restrained, and reluctant. During evening prayer, he noticed something unsettling: the rhythm. The sisters' responses fell slightly out of sync, as if following a delayed cue. The discrepancy was subtle, barely perceptible, yet once noticed, it could not be ignored. He wrote that during silent prayer, the air felt thick, resistant. "I had the sensation of moving through water," he noted. No formal exorcism was performed. Instead, Father Amorth conducted blessings over several days. The disturbances ceased gradually, without climax. He wrote that this case troubled him deeply. "It did not fight," he noted. "It withdrew." Another entry describes a case involving a child. Father Amorth approached such cases with extreme caution. He believed children were particularly vulnerable to misinterpretation and suggestion. The child was 8 years old. According to medical records, she suffered from night terrors and episodes of dissociation. Her parents were skeptical of spiritual explanations. They sought help only after the child began describing figures standing at the foot of her bed, repeating prayers incorrectly. Father Amorth insisted on observation without intervention. He spoke with the child gently, asking neutral questions. She appeared frightened but articulate. When asked about the figures, she described them not as frightening, but insistent. "They don't like when I sleep," she said. During one visit, Father Amorth silently recited a prayer. The child stopped speaking and covered her ears. "Don't think so loud," she whispered. The diary records that Father Amorth felt a sudden, sharp headache at that moment, localized behind his eyes. He left shortly thereafter. Weeks later, the family reported improvement after relocating to a different home. The disturbances ceased entirely. Father Amorth wrote that place mattered more than people in some cases. "Not all infestations attach to flesh," he noted. As the years advance, the diaries grow increasingly introspective. Father Amorth reflects on the cumulative weight of exposure. He writes of moments when ordinary sounds trigger unease. Footsteps behind him, breathing nearby, the sensation of being observed during prayer. He documents conversations with fellow priests who experienced similar effects. None spoke publicly. "They learned from us." One entry reads, "Observation is mutual." In a particularly unsettling passage dated nearly 40 years into his service, Father Amorth describes an exorcism that deviated sharply from ritual norms. The subject was a man in his 60s, brought in by church officials rather than family. Details are sparse. The diary omits background information entirely. The exorcism took place in a secured chapel under strict confidentiality. From the outset, the subject resisted verbally, not physically. He argued theology with precision. He questioned the legitimacy of Father Amorth's authority, citing obscure canonical texts. At one point, the subject smiled and addressed Father Amorth by a nickname known only to a childhood friend who had died decades earlier. Witnesses later confirmed Father Amorth visibly faltered. The diary records that the entity claimed familiarity not through observation, but through proximity. "We are closer than you believe," it said. The exorcism escalated rapidly. The subject's voice layered, as if multiple tones overlapped. The air grew cold. Candles extinguished, without explanation. Father Amorth wrote that for the first time in his career, he considered stopping, not out of fear for himself, but out of concern that continuation might deepen the attachment. He persisted. What followed is described in fragmented sentences, as if memory itself resisted coherence. A sudden pressure, a sensation of vertigo, a momentary loss of awareness. When Father Amorth regained clarity, the subject was unconscious. The room was silent. The witnesses appeared shaken but unharmed. The exorcism was declared incomplete. That night, Father Amorth wrote extensively. "I am no longer convinced that these encounters are isolated," he wrote. "There is continuity, memory, recognition." He began to question whether certain entities followed specific exorcists, learning their methods, their weaknesses, their patterns. "They adapt," he wrote, and adaptation implies intent. The diary entries from this period include repeated references to dreams. Not symbolic dreams. Literal reenactments of past cases. Rooms revisited. Voices repeated. Faces unchanged by time. He writes of waking with answers to questions he had not consciously asked. "I fear the boundary is thinner than doctrine admits," one entry reads. Near the end of the second volume, Father Amorth records a moment of quiet clarity. He describes sitting alone in a chapel after midnight. No case scheduled. No ritual planned. Only prayer. During that silence, he felt a familiar sensation. The pressure. The awareness. This time, he did not react. He continued praying. After several minutes, the sensation faded. He wrote a single sentence beneath the entry. "They retreat when ignored, but they do not forget." The final entry of this volume is brief. It records a meeting with a young priest recently assigned to assist him. The priest asked whether the work ever became easier. Father Amorth wrote his response carefully. "It becomes clearer," he told him. "That is worse." The diary ends not with reflection, but with observation. As Father Amorth closed the book that night, he heard a sound in the room. Not a voice, not a breath, but the faintest suggestion of movement, as if something shifted just beyond the limits of sight, waiting for the moment it would no longer need to hide. The final diary is thinner than the others. Fewer pages, narrower margins. The handwriting is smaller, tighter, as if Father Gabriele Amorth was conserving space, or time. According to archival notes attached to this volume, many of these entries were written late at night, often after long periods without sleep. The ink varies in darkness, suggesting interruptions, pauses, moments where the pen rested unmoving before continuing. The first entry opens with a statement that stands apart from everything written before it. "I no longer believe I am only recording events." There is no explanation, no elaboration, only the sentence underlined once. Father Amorth begins to describe a shift in the nature of the cases brought to him. Fewer dramatic manifestations, less overt resistance. Instead, a rise in subtle disturbances. Persistent despair. Sudden loss of faith in individuals previously devoted. A quiet erosion rather than collapse. He notes that many of those referred to him no longer believed they were possessed. "They believe they are empty," he writes. One case stands out in these pages, not for its violence, but for its familiarity. The subject was a woman in her late 40s, referred by a parish priest who had known her for decades. She was active in church life, reliable, calm. No history of instability. She requested a meeting not because of suffering, but because of absence. "I cannot feel anything," she told him. Not prayer, not fear, not hope. Father Amorth wrote that her demeanor was composed, almost relieved. She spoke of her condition as one might speak of weather. Neutral, unemotional. He began with conversation, observation, silent prayer. There was no immediate reaction. Minutes passed. Then she asked him a question. "Do you ever wonder if silence answers back?" The diary records that Father Amorth felt a sudden chill at that moment. though the room temperature had not changed. He proceeded cautiously. He spoke prayers aloud. The woman listened politely. She nodded occasionally. Nothing happened. Only as the meeting concluded did she say one final thing. "It said you would try harder." Father Amorth did not ask who it was. The diary reveals that in his later years, Father Amorth began to perceive patterns not tied to individuals, but to himself. Repeated phrases, familiar tones, recurrent strategies. They test for fatigue, he wrote. They wait for familiarity to dull caution. He documents moments where he felt sudden hesitation before prayer, an uncharacteristic reluctance that vanished once noticed. He interpreted these moments not as weakness, but as intrusion. They cannot command, he noted. They suggest. One of the most disturbing entries describes an exorcism performed shortly before his retirement from active ministry. The subject was a young man brought by church authorities under strict confidentiality. No background information is included, no medical history, only the ritual itself. From the beginning, the atmosphere was oppressive. Father Amorth wrote of difficulty concentrating, as if his thoughts were being interrupted mid-formation. The subject did not resist physically. He sat calmly, eyes half-lidded, breathing slow. When the prayers began, the subject smiled, not mockingly, not cruelly, knowingly. The voice that followed was soft, almost respectful. "You are tired," it said. Father Amorth continued. The voice spoke again. "You have given enough." Witnesses later reported that at this point, Father Amorth paused for several seconds, longer than any present had ever observed. The diary confirms this hesitation. "I felt the truth in the words," he wrote. "That frightened me more than the lie." The exorcism did not escalate. There was no shouting, no contortions, only conversation attempts, interruptions, suggestions framed as compassion. When the ritual ended, the subject appeared unchanged, calm, silent. Father Amorth declared the session inconclusive. That night, he wrote extensively. "They no longer need to frighten me," he wrote. "They attempt to release me." As the entries approach the final pages, Father Amorth reflects openly on the cost of his work. He writes of isolation, not imposed by the church, but by necessity. "There are things one cannot describe without transferring them," he noted. He writes of moments when he chose silence over explanation, believing that knowledge carried risk. The mind is an invitation. One passage reads, in the penultimate entry, Father Amorth recounts an incident that occurred without a subject, without ritual, without witnesses. He was alone in his room, reviewing notes. The hour was late. The building was quiet. He felt the now familiar sensation of awareness. This time, it did not recede. He describes the air growing heavy, resistant. His thoughts slowed. Prayer required effort, as if spoken against a current. Then, he felt something he had never recorded before. Recognition. Not from the presence toward him, but from himself toward it. "I knew it," he wrote. Not as an enemy, but as a constant. He did not see anything. He did not hear a voice. But he understood a message clearly, without words. This work would never end. Not with him. Not with any one exorcist. It was not a battle with conclusions, but a maintenance of boundaries. "They are not defeated," he wrote. "They are restrained." The final diary entry is dated months later. It is brief. Father Amorth writes that his health is failing, that his hands tremble when he writes. That prayer remains possible, though effortful. He writes one last observation. "Evil does not seek spectacle," he notes. It seeks permission. The last line is written smaller than the rest, almost pressed into the page. And permission is easiest when no one believes it is being asked. According to church records, Father Gabriele Amorth died quietly, surrounded by prayer. Those who cataloged his diaries noted one final detail. The last page bears a faint indentation beneath the writing, as if another line had once been pressed into the paper, but never inked. No one could determine what it said, or why, after 40 years of meticulous documentation, he chose not to write it.